Howdy, y'all. John Paul here. We're still all dealing with Corona, obviously. Hope you're all safe and well and healthy, and all your families are. Today I'm going to talk about Yorktown and the museum there. Yorktown is probably the most important location to deal with the American Revolution. While you have Paul Revere's Ride and the Boston Tea Party that were the beginning requires an end, and we didn't win our independence until Yorktown. And see, throughout the American Revolution, the British took the city of New York, the biggest city in America, nearly at the beginning of the war. And the Americans never took it back. The sheer number of troops the British had at their disposal outnumbered the Americans total more than 4-1 throughout the war. It was very rare that Americans had the same numbers, and much less at the headquarters of the entire British war effort in North America. But the British knew the Americans wanted New York back. George Washington obsessed about taking of it because there was no way to win the war without pushing the British completely out of North America and the 13 colonies, and New York being one of them. But due to the fact that the Americans with George Washington played a defensive war and chose the battles they wanted to fight and when they wanted to fight, when it was best opportune for them for most of the part of the war. George Washington was playing a war of attrition. I'm going to keep you in the field, burning through money and burning through men, which required the British that were already heavily taxed, and that's why they wanted to tax the Americans so heavily, was to pay for past wars. They had to make up that money other places while they fought the Americans, spending even more money. So their tax pool had shrunk because of the American Revolution, and there was no way out of the financial burdens. On top of that, they had to keep pouring men in because they were losing them through battles, through illness, just through the war. And the more land they took, the more army they had to disperse, weakening them in different places. So they had to bring in more troops continuously. The Americans under George Washington had stopped the pincer movement. Is British and early in the war wanted to slice up the colonies into four major chunks and then pacify them one by one, ending the war that way. They had gotten stopped in the north trying to cut off New England at the Battle of Saratoga, which was a crushing defeat for the British and helped aid the French in joining the American cause. But then the war had moved to the south. And in the south, while the Americans lost battle after battle, they kept having hundreds and thousands fill their ranks, skirmish after skirmish, fighting the British. The British could take land, but it meant no significance, and the Americans were smart enough to pull and harvest any food that they could find and skirmish and drain the resources of the British, causing them to ship more food over and spending more money, along with more troops and dividing their troops up. Well, under Cornwallis, they marched through most of the South. And then, after a number of battles, and Cowpen being one of them, that was a major defeat for the British in losing men, a portion of their army. They had pulled back because for the entire war, the British had the most powerful navy in the world. And that's what they counted on to maneuver their troops where they wanted them and land without any ability for the Americans to stop them. So the British knew that their navy always could resupply them and pull them out when they needed to and put them in new places. So they backed up on a peninsula known as Yorktown, waiting on resupplyment. Meanwhile, George Washington was known to be in the north, just outside of New York, and the British were pulling up troops from there everywhere they could to max their numbers, knowing that Washington wanted New York, and that's what the battle was going to be. So Cornwallis, in having to send some troops to help in New York, further reducing his numbers, pulled up on the peninsula of Yorktown to hold his line there and wait for resupplyment and aid and more troops. Meanwhile, George Washington masterfully tricked the British into thinking he was going to strike New York and pulled his entire army down south, leaving just small numbers of men to keep fires burning and make noise to sound like the full army, while the main army moved down and united up in the south with the southern forces of the American colonies that had sieged Cornwallis, and with their French allies supplying troops and ships, which had won a naval battle against a few units of the British Navy. Now, the British under Cornwallis were completely cut off from resupply from the sea and the land. And after weeks of bombardment and taking two key defensive positions, the British knew that they could not hold and they must surrender. General Cornwallis hid in shame and instructed his aide to surrender not to George Washington, but to the commander of the French forces, which would not accept the surrender, and it was given to George Washington. And George Washington stepped aside so his aide could take the sword of Cornwallis from Cornwallis's aide, not wanting the dissent that the British were trying to throw at George Washington on Cornwallis in hiding versus surrendering himself. And with this was the biggest number of troops to surrender to the Americans, and was the final body blow to the British cause in the war. The British had now lost two full armies through the course of the war at Saratoga and now at Yorktown. Their money was stretched thin, and it just wasn't financially worth it to continue the war. And then 2 years of negotiating afterwards brought about the freedom and the end of the war officially, but Yorktown being the last battle to be fought before the British pulled out of all areas in North America, its colonies. And this brought the end of the war. This is why it's so important. This is where the American country got its freedom. There were many battles before it and many events leading up to it, but this was the final sledgehammer through the glass that ensured America's freedom from the British crown forever. And that's why it should be toured by children and college students alike. I was there with my family years ago. But thank you guys for listening, and I hope this was eventful and informative for you. And please go see Yorktown whenever you get the chance. Bye, y'all.